Hello. Hi, I think we're public now. And this is, I'm Steve Courtney. I'm the Curatorial Special Projects Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. And we have the good luck today to have with us Ms. Susy Clemens, who may not be completely familiar with the technology, so there was a very slight delay in our start. And but I will, however, like the Wizard of Oz didn't want to do, pull aside the curtain and say this is actually Grace DiModugno, who's in the Living History program at the Mark Twain House and Museum. This is the second of our Trouble at Home sessions. You may know that Mark Twain used to put on his lecture posters, "The Trouble Begins at 8." For 10 years, we've had a program at the Mark Twain House called "The Trouble Begins at 5:30" because people go to bed earlier in Hartford. And this is what we're doing in the course of this time when we cannot, unfortunately, welcome all 234 of you to the Mark Twain House. In fact, the fire marshal might not even like that idea if it were possible. Anyway, to get on to Susy, let me say two important things. One is, if you do have a question, rather than putting it in the chats, there is a little place, if you can see this right down there, that says "Ask a Question," and our wonderful supervisor here, Jennifer LaRue, will record it and ask it at the end. There is also a place you can click for donations. Very important to us, especially in this time. It's important for everybody in this time. But it's, of course, important for a museum like ours, which is dedicated to preserving the heritage of Mark Twain and his literature and his life. Which included, of course, his, I think, fascinating eldest daughter, Susy. Olivia Susan Clemens was her full name, born in 1872, just about 2 years before they moved into the Hartford house in 1874, and instantly made a mark on the family as a character. Many people feel that she was definitely the writer in the family, not counting her dad. But I would like to invite Grace, who, let me quickly mention the Living History program, of course, is something set up a few years ago by Betsy McGuire, who was a glorious historic interpreter, an artist, a playwright, an actor. And she decided and worked very hard to get the program set up by which members of the family, members of the household can take you through the Mark Twain House. And I know Grace will be telling us a little bit more about that. So Grace, tell us a little bit about Susy.
Well, I mean, I better keep it rather brief because I could make you all stay here for quite a few hours talking about Susy.
That's fine.
But Susy Clemens, like you said, was the oldest daughter of Mark Twain and, of course, Samuel Clemens, for those of you who don't know. And she was a very interesting girl, very intense. I think that I've really come to find from my research of her and from just really embodying her character in the house is she was a very intense girl. Either she was intensely happy, she was intensely upset, and she was very passionate about what she did, very similar to her father. And so Susy and her sisters lived in the house in Hartford for 17 years with their parents. And those 17 years were considered probably, I'd say, the happiest years of all their lives. Wouldn't you agree, Steve?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yes. So I guess, Susy was very intelligent, very similar to her father, like you mentioned, Steve. She loved to write. She started to write a little biography of her father when she was only about 13, and she titled it Papa, of course. And while she may not have been the best speller, she had wonderful, wonderful insight into her father and also the rest of the family members living in the house. And she wrote in that on and off for a couple of years. And I'd say that's probably my Susy Bible in a sense.
Yeah, I always remember that she talked about how her mother would listen to readings of her father's manuscripts in the library at the Mark Twain House, and how her mother would, as she put it, expurgate them.
Yes, she's not fond of that.
And the way she spelled expurgate was quite creative, as I recall.
Yes.
But also she was absolutely disappointed to see some beloved passage removed because it might have the word sweat instead of perspiration in it, and that kind of thing. So, but she and Clara, I get the feeling that she and the next child, Clara, were the ones who were, they were quite close for a while before Jean, the very youngest, was born, about 6 years after they moved into the house. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. That's about correct. Jean was 1880 is when she was born. So that would make it about 6 years.
So she was the baby. And so Clara and Susan had quite a time before that. There's a room in the Mark Twain house that Clara marked up a plan of the Mark Twain house in old age, where the people were beginning to restore it. And they wanted to know what was going on. Clara lived till 1962, so she was available in the late 50s to do this. And there was one room on the third floor where she said, "This is where we kept our squirrels." Do you know that story?
Oh, yes. That is one of my favorites to talk about. Clara was very fond of her squirrels. And I remember I talk about it in my tour, actually, quite a bit. Every time we go up onto the third floor, because everyone is interested in the squirrel story. And usually the way it goes about is, Clara was hiding, I believe, 2 squirrels in the spare little side closet. And Sam Clemens, her father, finds out about it. And I'm not sure how much Susy was involved in the squirrels. That's something I have yet to figure out. But Clara was definitely the squirrel mastermind. And so she was basically in the room with the squirrels. Sam opened the door, and one of the squirrels jumped up onto Clara's shoulder. And Sam was worried that they were going to bite her or attack her. And she said, "Oh, no, Papa, they only gnaw wood." Oh. And, well, the squirrel hid in the closet. So
I didn't know that story. That's wonderful.
So it's definitely a fun one.
Yeah. Well, just before we go on about Susy, and tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into this living history racket?
That's a good question. But now that they've got me, they're going to be hard pressed to get rid of me. Well, I think I started, I was actually just looking to become a general guide at the Mark Twain House, which I also do, and both are wonderful in their own ways, really. But I had just graduated college, and I knew that I very much wanted to be working with history. And one of my professors, Dr. Carrie Driscoll, who you interviewed earlier, or at least 2 weeks ago, she, of course, being the wonderful Mark Twain scholar she is, had recommended that I go look at the Mark Twain House. And in reality, I'd only visited the Mark Twain House probably my 3rd year in college, even though I'd lived in Connecticut for quite some time. But I applied here, and then I also found that in the applications there was this living history sort of thing, and I had no idea what that meant, but I saw that it involved acting. And I was really excited because I also was very involved in theater. I love acting. And I thought, wouldn't that be such an interesting concept to combine the truth of history with the, drama of acting and kind of have them support and help each other And so I met with Tom Raines, our living history manager, and it was kind of history from there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the I mean, it's a terrific program, and but you had done some theater in college, is that right?
I had, yes.
Yeah. Oh, and full disclosure, Susy, or that is Grace, and I trod the boards together at the Mark Twain House for a wonderful one-act play written by Bruce Michelson about a purported meeting between Mark Twain and the painter Monet in France, right around the time when, in fact, in history, they were both in the area. And I had the privilege of playing the artist Monet, painting the Rouen Cathedral series, and then I encounter Mark, who was played by Kit Webb, our wonderful Mark Twain guy, and then of course Grace was Susy. So a little side trip there, but going back, yes, you mentioned Tom Raines. He's he is our George Griffin. George Griffin was the family butler, and then when Betsy left, he became director of the program, and he's just a marvelous guy. Just we had him speak at the Mark Twain House last year, his whole crew of living history people came and enjoyed that, or all that could make it anyway. It was quite a good support group, and so what is it like working with Tom? Does he set down rules for what you should do? Does he follow along and pick away at what you're doing while you're on tour?
Well, I would say that working with Tom is a lot of fun, really, because he helps you to understand as an actor how to be your own director, in a sense, because there's something very unique in looking at living history as I guess from an acting perspective, because normally as an actor you have a director saying, oh, you should stand here maybe, or possibly you should say this line with this tone of voice. You kind of have a little bit more guidance, or you have interaction between fellow actors, and with living history being you essentially almost delivering just an hour and 15-minute monologue, but not even that, an improvised dialogue and monologue with all of your guests on the tour. It's a very different form of acting. I would say it's probably a little bit closer to improv, but with the guidelines of having this historical database in your brain that you have to pull from. So you can't just say Mark Twain was responsible for the Kennedy assassination, because of course that would not be true, I think. But, then you have things, people will ask you questions that are not in your quote unquote script. And I think that Tom is excellent at giving that direction. He'll listen to what you have, and he'll give you some suggestions, and he'll say, consider this, or, have this in mind when you're having to, manipulate a large group of people around some fragile items, or, go up the stairs, certain things like that. And I think that he is excellent at doing that, but not stifling your own creative freedom. So I think that he has an excellent balance in that.
Mm. Yeah. So I think it's interesting that you see it as being closer to improv than acting, in which, of course, you memorize lines and then you have to work your actions around those. Do you? You must have to think on your feet a lot and turn on a dime, as they say. Do you?
Oh, yeah.
So, are there any particular incidents you can remember where you've had to suddenly think fast?
There are a couple of them.
Can you repeat them?
One that I can think of specifically, and the reason why it sticks in my head, it was one of my very first tours that I gave at the house, but it was probably my first week, and I had just been given the big thumbs up to be taking people through the house on my own. And so I was completely petrified. And I was still, in the process of, I had a script and I had information, but I could always be getting more. And I think that's also really interesting, is you can always be gleaning more information about the person that you are portraying, the people who they interact with, the time that they live in, and I feel like that's true of any scholar, is that there's always more to learn. But this particular tour, I had this very lovely lady who informed me that she was an expert in Victorian interior design. And I was not an expert in Victorian interior design, and probably knew less then than I do now. And so she kept nitpicking little tiny things about the house as we went through, and we got to the mahogany room, which, for those of you who haven't visited the house, it is the first floor guest bedroom, and it's a beautiful, beautiful room. But currently, we do not have any heavy drapes in that room. And that was the first thing that the woman said as we entered the room. She said, "Where are the heavy drapes?
Donate for the heavy drapes."
Please donate for the heavy drapes. And so she said, "Where are the heavy drapes? And there's no canopy over the bed." And she was completely right. There should have been heavy drapes and there should have been a canopy over the bed. However, I couldn't tell her that we didn't necessarily have the funding to be putting up accurate heavy drapes. So I kind of blurted out, "It's laundry day." And I just kind of left it at that. And I was like, "Everything's being washed. I'm so sorry."
That is good. That is quick thinking. That was great. Yeah.
So I've gotten a little bit better from laundry day, but sometimes that sort of stuff does happen. But technically, it could have been. So.
Yeah, I mean, the drapes are removed sometimes. They don't just sit there. That's very good. And did she shut up?
On the drapes, she did.
Good. Yeah. Well, of course, Susy wouldn't have known a great deal about all of this either. I mean, she wasn't an expert on Victorian design because she lived in the midst of it, and
exactly,
it was just the drapes. Yeah.
Well, and also that's what's fun too, is that, or at least it's helpful for certain living history characters, is that your character might not necessarily know all the things that another character would. So, Susy's mother, Livy Clemens, might know a great deal more about the interior of the house and the design work because she was so instrumental in helping put it together, basically. Whereas Susy would probably know a little bit more about, the family dynamics and her sisters and her father's manuscripts and things like that.
Do we have... I'm talking to Jennifer behind the scenes. Do we have a picture of Susy? There was a technical thing that happened that might mean we don't, but I can hold one up. Are you there?
Steve, I think you're going to have to hold one up because I've been working on that, and I'm sorry it didn't work.
No, that's all right. This is my next question for you, Grace, will be, what age Susy are you portraying? This is a famous picture of the family on the porch, the ombra, they called it, which is Italian for shade, because the porch was a great place to sit in the summer. And what we have here is, of course, Livy Clemens over here. We have Clara up there. Jean, where's Jean? Down below. Flash, the dog, on the porch. Mark, as many of his friends called him, even though his real name was Sam. And here is Susy. I will get this as close as possible. And she's about 13 there. And so what age are you, Susy, when you're Susy?
So I portray Susy in 1889. So Susy is about roughly 17 years old at the time. And so I do play a little bit of an older Susy, probably the oldest she could be before she went off to college, around 1890. And so, Yeah, that's roughly the age that I portray her. Any younger, and then of course I think it would look a bit silly, because while I do have quite a youthful face, I am unfortunately not able to portray a 14-year-old girl.
Yeah, I figured it was about that. So, and that's the time of the love chase, right?
Yes.
And tell us about that a little bit. What was that all about?
So the Love Chase is actually a short play that Susy wrote. It was a play in 2 acts, and she wrote it for her father, and she put it on in the house, and Clara was involved, Jean was involved, 2 sisters, and then Susy's 2 friends, Daisy Warner and Fanny Freese. So she had her 2 friends and then her 2 younger sisters involved in this play, and it was based, as Mark Twain would say, along the Greek lines. It was sort of a play about the muses or goddesses, I guess you could call them, but it was very abstract. Susy played the character of music, Clara played the character of art, and Jean played the character of Cupid. And of course, Cupid's role was very small, as Jean was rather young at the time. So Cupid has maybe 2 tiny scenes where she comes on the stage and comes off the stage.
Yeah, we have, of course, we have various pictures of that play, which I cannot quickly find. I did find another picture of Susy, though, which is quite intense and quite moved in on. Again, this is more in the 13-year-old period, but there she was. And one thing that seems to characterize pictures of her, as you mentioned, she was deeply thoughtful, and you can really see that in her eyes, which are just extraordinarily introspective, and of course, anyone who knows much about Mark Twain and his life knows that ultimately there was a great tragedy for Susy. This is now 7 years after the time that you're portraying. And did you want to talk about that, or is it too?
No, certainly.
Really depressing.
I mean, I don't believe you would mind.
Good.
Well, in 1896, Susy sadly did pass away very young at the age of 24 due to spinal meningitis. And she passed away, and much of her family wasn't there. I believe only Jean was there in terms of her mother and her sisters and her father. But it was very sudden, and it was very tragic. And so because of that, a lot of people have insinuated that Susy's death was one of the main catalysts to affect Sam's later writing, and the shift from this very joyous, humorous, almost boyish author who wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Prince and the Pauper, to someone who would pen things like The Mysterious Stranger or What is Man, or many of his later, much more pessimistic, I guess would be a kind way to put it, works.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And it was also the reason, really, ultimately, that they chose not to return to the Hartford house, because when they left in 1891, it was supposed to be a temporary arrangement to kind of recoup their fortunes, but by the time they might have returned, I know Mark Twain wrote a letter to a friend saying, "It's no longer the city of Hartford; it's the city of heartbreak."
Heartbreak. Yeah.
So that sad part. Obviously, if some visitor has heard this story and is asking you about your death, what do you do?
Well, it happens a lot, Steve. It happens a lot.
I thought it might. It's a well-known story.
It is a well-known story. And I guess, the way I always approach it is our former Dr. James Golden wrote a really interesting article that I consistently go back to on Susy Clemens and her death, and how she's almost become defined by her death. And I think it's so important to portray her not as someone who's defined by her death, but as someone who's defined by her life, and not necessarily just how it relates to Sam, because she was an individual and she often found a lot of frustration from being labeled almost as just this little add-on to Mark Twain, because she didn't see her father as just this funny writer. She saw him as an intellectual, a philosopher, all these things that she felt some of his works didn't fully, I guess, display. So to go back to your point on a tour, everyone at some point will say, "Are you dead?" Or, you know, "How did you die? Am I allowed to say you're dead?" And usually I've actually now incorporated into my general spiel at the beginning of my tour. I'll say, you know, the year is 1889. I am very much alive, and I would like to remain so at least for the duration of the tour. Thank you very much.
Well done. But at the very, oh, by the way, that Dr. James Golden was the former education director at the Mark Twain House. And the essay is in a wonderful book called Mark Twain and Youth, edited by Kent Rasmussen and Kevin McDonnell, available in the Mark Twain store, which is alive and active. If you want to go to our website, you'll figure out a way to buy it. That is, I think it's available. I haven't checked the inventory, but it is an excellent essay. There's other essays in there that are well worth reading about Mark Twain and young people at various stages of his life, and by a whole bunch of interesting scholars. But back from the commercial, at the end of your tours, you do break character, right? They end in the cellar of the house. Is that correct? And there's a table full of artifacts. I mean, the visitors have been told they can't touch a thing except the banister as they walk up the stairs. And suddenly there's a table with all kinds of, some of them original Victorian artifacts, but they're common enough and not part of the collection, and they can be picked up and looked at and that kind of thing. And then the living history character is able to break character. And what kinds of questions do you get then? They say, "Oh, I can finally ask you about your death."
Well, if someone hasn't already asked me about the death, people will often ask, you know, did Susy go on to become a writer like Mark Twain? Or what happened to the rest of the family is usually a very common question. And then, you know, in a brief way, or at least as brief as you can possibly make it, I just kind of go over, you know, the family leaving the house in 1891 due to financial difficulties, as you had mentioned earlier. And because of that, them all kind of transitioning over to Europe for a period of time. And then subsequently the years of Susy's death and Sam's wife's death. He had a lot of loss in his life. And so if there are little ones on the tour, I try to not dwell on that as much. But if there are people who are more interested in specific detail, then I'll go more into, I guess, the specifics of the Clemens family's demises.
And what you mentioned, that Susy's book, or Susy's biography of her dad, which is actually reprinted in this book I held up previously, A Family Sketch, which is a glorious book edited by a man named Ben Griffin out at the Mark Twain Papers in Berkeley, where Carrie Driscoll, who was on last week, a week before last, works. And he put together a lot of these documents about the family, including a family sketch itself is sort of a tribute to Susy after her death, that then expands into a description of the whole household and contains a lot of what we know about the servants and so on and so forth. But he also includes that famous little biography by Susy in it. But what I meant to ask you was, what other sorts of research did you do in your Susy pursuits?
Well, I guess it's hard to track down all of them just because I feel like quite a few of them were varied. But A Family Sketch that you just mentioned, my book is in a little bit worse shape than yours, unfortunately. I really used that book very heavily, especially in terms of Susy's patterns of speech, because while she is very young when she's writing that book, there are a lot of words she favors. There are certain things she says about her father, and really, I think it's only fair to Susy to try to portray her as accurately and realistically as possible. And so I try to use some of her own phrases if possible. And if I can't recall an exact phrase, then the best approximation that my brain can give. And then other books I've used, I do have a script that was written by, I believe Betsy was the one who originally penned all of the original living history scripts. But that script is wonderful because it actually has a lot of resources in the back of where certain pieces from certain rooms have been gleaned from. And so I will often go back to those primary sources as well. Sam's books. We know for a fact that Susy's favorite book by her father was The Prince and the Pauper. And it's a really interesting book. And the reason why she enjoys it so much, or at least the reason why she wrote that she enjoyed it so much, was that she felt it gave the closest approximation to the father that she knew Sam was, versus Mark Twain, the persona that he sort of kind of portrayed to the public. Because it has a really nice balance of humor, but also a lot of, she says, a variety of feeling.
That's an interesting point. I don't remember that. And he can't have been the easiest of fathers.
Supposedly, he was actually a very, I guess you would call him progressive father for the time, especially considering it was the Victorian era, and middle-class families were relatively, I wouldn't say standoffish towards their children, but they were definitely not as involved, especially fathers. And so Sam was a doting father to his three daughters. In fact, his wife Livy was the one who had to do all of the punishments and all of the strictness and all of that. Sam really liked to spoil the girls.
Like to spoil them. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, almost. Susy was rather a terror when she was younger. And so he and Sam and Olivia were a little harder on her when she was in her young Modoc phase.
Modoc, yes, that's a tribe of Native Americans who were at that point involved in war with the government, correct? So
yes,
she became the Modoc, meaning the warrior, so to speak. Exactly,
and she definitely had her tantrums, but as she got older, she was able to better control them.
Right. So what do you think? So aside from theater in college and University of St. Joseph, right?
Yes.
And when did you graduate?
I graduated in 2018.
2018. Wow.
It feels like yesterday.
And but aside from that, you studied English.
I studied English and history. Yep.
And what do you? Well, obviously you may be prejudiced, but what do you think about this way of transmitting what they call public history, historical information through play acting?
I think it's a really interesting way to kind of reinvigorate history to people who may or may not be, I guess, struggling with the concept of retaining history and considering it as something important. Because I know that going through college, I did have quite a few people who would say, "Oh, you're studying history? That's so boring. You know, I took a history class in high school and I slept through the whole thing." You know, sorts of stuff like that. And everyone's like, "I remember Abraham Lincoln and Hitler and something about the Great Depression, and that's it." And of course, you know, that's just American history, not necessarily world history. But Mark Twain himself found history fascinating. He was very interested in history, the history of England. That's kind of where that Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court came from. And also, exactly, and The Prince and the Pauper. And so to kind of bring the history to life, where it's not just even like an animatronic person, for example, just relaying history, like I'm thinking of like the Abraham Lincoln or the presidents that Disneyland used to have or something, which was a wonderful concept. But there's something really interesting about being able to, say, hey, Susie, what's your favorite room of the house? Or ask George Griffin what his favorite meal is, or something like that, where it's so much more interesting to be able to, I guess, I don't know, engage that way. And to be able to kind of pick the brain of people who have studied something very specific. And people can always teach you things as well. Like I said, I had a Victorian interior design specialist on one of my first tours. And she was kind enough to tell me some information once I broke character. So really, it's kind of a back and forth as well.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And do you go running to the curatorial library to solve some problem because of a difficult question? How do you deal with it?
A couple of times.
Yes, Tom Raines, I suspect you're out there, but I'm going to shame you again with this story. But Tom came up wanting to know what Mark Twain drank first thing in the morning, coffee or tea. He did not, and he's George Griffin, the butler. He has to know. Have you had experiences like that? It's coffee, but.
Well, I mean, definitely I've had certain experiences. One of them would be the play that Susie wrote, A Love Chase. Of course, that I went running to you, Steve, about wanting to know more about the play itself because it had been mentioned in my script. And so oftentimes I would offhandedly mention the play throughout my tour because Susie did love acting and she loved theater and she wanted to be a great actress when she grew up, and her mother was not too keen on the idea. But someone asked me, what's A Love Chase about? And I didn't know. I genuinely did not know what Susie's play was about. And I'm like, I'm Susie. I wrote the thing. So I was quite happy to finally be able to read it through and to be able to, grasp a little bit more about what she was writing about.
Yeah. And it's about, well, you mentioned it briefly before, but it's about what figures like representing art and literature and music. And they're all in love with a shepherd boy. Is that
yes.
It? So I don't remember the details of the plot, but that's
it's a very fun play. Hopefully, we might be able to, in the future, put something together where it could be performed. I know that myself and a couple other living history folks were interested in that, which would be oodles of fun. Especially since, of course, it is Susie's original work and it's not her father's, but they are connected. Goodness, sorry, my train of thought. I just watched it go out that window over there.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, though, as you mentioned, running to go find different things when you have a question. I did something recently. I had a tour where that sort of backfired on me, where I thought I had enough information, and it turns out I did not. I very much did not.
Mm-hmm. And there are more Susies too, of course. You have colleagues who are also Susie. Do you ever get together and talk Susie stuff?
I don't think we've ever just collaborated us Susies, although that would be very interesting to do. I think that we could probably pool our minds together. And I'm sure that, each of us would have some smidge of information that the other one didn't. So
are there two more? Are there two more?
I don't actually know who is currently in rotation as Susie. I know, oh goodness, I've forgotten her last name. Anne, who's a lovely Susie. And then Ariana also was one of our Susies as well. And both of them were excellent. But what was very interesting is we were all very different Susys. And I think that that was really nice, is that we weren't all just trying to robotically be the same person, is that we kind of were able to take different elements of Susy herself and sort of make them as real as we could make them. So it wasn't like we were all just trying to fit into a specific mold. It was very dynamic. And I feel like that happens with a lot of the living history actors who all portray the same person.
Great. Well, I'm guessing that we can probably move on to questions unless you have anything more you want to say, or
I guess
living history. We have, of course, a couple of Livys, at least two, and we have George Griffin. We have, who was the butler. Then there are some Patrick McAleer, the coachman, and who am I forgetting?
Did you say Lizzie Wills, the housemaid?
I did not. Oh, she's the most important one. Well, no, I'm sorry. Susy's the most important one. They're all important. Sorry, but yeah, actually, Betsy, who started the program, Betsy McGuire, was the extraordinary Lizzie Wills. Well, Lizzie Wills, if you know her story, she was a maid in the family who was the occasion for an extraordinary story that Mark Twain told in his day. It was a real incident involving a young man who was courting Lizzie and was found sort of slipping in and out of the house illicitly. You'll have to go look it up. Lizzie Wills, Wills, just sort of Google it. And there's a whole series of letters by Clemens while it was going on. There's pardon me if I switch from Mark to Sam to Clemens. It ultimately became literature in a very odd way, a story called Whopping Alice, but I'll leave it at that, I think. And maybe, Jennifer, if some questions have arisen, we can take them now.
Here I come.
Here you are. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, that was a little slower than I would have hoped. My goodness, look how many people. You guys would fill our auditorium and then some tonight. So this is just so gratifying to see how many people are here, and the chat has been just full of enthusiastic, excited people. So I'm excited for that. And thank you, Grace and Steve, for doing this for us. Very exciting. So we have got a lot of really good questions. Are you game?
Absolutely.
All right, let's go. Have you had any experiences with Susy's ghost in the house?
Well, that's an excellent question. I personally have not. I had an experience where I accidentally may have startled someone and they thought I was Susy's ghost. Of course, that someone was poor Mallory. I'm so sorry, Mallory. We ran into each other in the basement, and neither one of us knew that the other one was there. The basement is where us living history actors get costumed and we get ready to go out. And so I was just in the basement getting changed for a tour, but I think I hadn't had a tour before, so I was a bit early, and I thought I heard something coming down the stairs. And so I walked out of and the basement is, well, it looks lovely now, but it has its noises. And so I walked around the corner and I literally almost bowled Mallory over, and she almost bowled me over. And I don't know if she remembers this as vividly as I did, but I thought I was going to drop dead. I was so scared to see someone else. And then I thought, I'm dressed in character, so I'm sure she was not as happy either. So yeah, that's my only Susy ghost story. And that was unfortunately me.
This is Mallory Howard, our wonderful assistant curator, who Grace managed to terrify.
And maybe people who are on the chat can chime in, because I know that there are other staff members who have had Susy encounters. So maybe they can chime in and let us know. So, Susy Clemens, your father was known to America as a great humorist. What were the favorite jokes you liked to hear from him or jokes played on him? That came from 5 people, including Walter Powell from Plymouth, Massachusetts.
That's a very good question. Favorite jokes. Well, I'm not sure, actually, what Susy's favorite jokes necessarily were. I know she had some favorite stories of his, and I know that she had some stories that she did not enjoy at all. But I would say that she really liked, the jokes played on Sam, basically, at dinner parties, when Sam invented a game for his girls to play called Dusting Off Papa, because sometimes he could get a bit carried away during dinner time, and especially if he had quite an audience, as the Clemens family loved to entertain. Sometimes he said things that his wife was not so keen on, off-color stories, inappropriate jokes. And so he invented this game called Dusting Off Papa. And the 3 girls, who at that time were still a little too young to attend dinner parties, they would hide behind a screen and listen and try to catch him making any social blunders. And each blunder had a color assigned to it. So if he was speaking too loudly, they would try to whisper to their mother the color blue. And then Olivia, in her very, very elegant way, would attempt to incorporate the color into the table conversation, so that Sam would be aware of what his mishap was.
That's awesome. So there are more questions from the audience, but I'm going to exert my privilege here and ask another question of my own. We talk a lot about Susy's relationship with her father. What was her relationship like with her mother? And her mother is known to have been a little, I won't say prudish, but she kept her husband in check a little bit. Where do you think Susy fell along those lines?
Well, we know that, at least from a very, very young age, Susy was very close with her mother. And actually, Olivia, and I know it's confusing. So Olivia, when I refer to Olivia, I mean Olivia Clemens, Sam's wife. And so Susy's name was also Olivia.
Right.
Confuse things even more. But Susy's mother was worried and wrote in her diary that she was afraid that her daughter would grow to dislike her, and that sometimes she saw that happening with some of her friends. And she ended up having a conversation with Susy, who was very young at the time. And Susy said, "Oh no, Mama, I don't believe that we shall ever disagree. In fact, we seem like the same person."
Oh, wow.
So I think that's
That's beautiful. I'm so glad to have got that. Oh my goodness. 3 people, starting with Don Pellegrino, have asked, can you please give a short monologue from your tour? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that and whether you are able and willing to do that. So let me keep moving. Skip wants to know, are there any of the items in the house that actually belong to Susy? So anything that's still in the collection in the house that actually belong to Susy, do you know? Or can anybody else help with that, Steve?
There are.
I don't know about you, Steve, but there are a couple items that I can think off the top of my head. There's Susy's little rocking chair in the family room or the library that's right next to her father's red velvet chair. And then I believe Susy also has a doll in the nursery. I believe one of the dolls does belong to her.
Oh, really? I don't think I knew that.
I'm not sure, though.
It's close. It belonged to Ida Langdon, who was a niece, and thus may have been played with by Susy and Clara, and maybe even Jean. But Ida Langdon was a wonderful person, an early benefactor of the Mark Twain House. She lived in Elmira, New York. She was one of Livy's family, and she gave a lot of items to the museum, and including this wonderful doll, which has a little gray tam o' shanter and a pair of gloves on her lap.
All right, I know that one. Awesome. Thank you both for that.
Straight.
See,
I knew one of the two was right.
I love this question from your colleague Josh, asking, can you see yourself in Susy Clemens?
That's an excellent question, Josh. I'd say that it's probably relatively, easy is not the word, but I do see a lot of, I guess, qualities that I very much sympathize and empathize with in Susy. She was the oldest daughter, and I was the oldest kid, and she was very intense. I've had quite a few people tell me in my life that I'm a little bit too intense. And, you know, she very much just was trying so hard to be her own individual, you know, and that's hard when you have a father who is Mark Twain. And so, you know, I think there's something very humanizing about that characteristic in Susy, and it's something that's very easy to sympathize with. And so, yes, I definitely see a lot of qualities in Susy that I relate to.
That comes through in your presentation, I have to say. There are so many good questions. Are you guys good to keep going for a few more minutes?
Sure.
Oh, Lonnie wants to know, do you feel Susy felt the unfairness of being born a woman in those times? Did she believe in women's rights?
That's a good question. Sam definitely became an advocate of women's rights, but that was later on in his life. However, he did marry a college-educated woman. So his wife, Livy, was educated at Elmira Women's College, and Susy attended Bryn Mawr College for about a year, right before the family had some bankruptcy issues. So I would say that he definitely supported women's education. So I feel like Susy, probably much less than other girls at the time, would have felt any sort of, you know, oppression, especially due to the Victorian time. And especially with Sam being a little bit more of I'm not really sure of the right word, but a little bit more out there as a parent and a father, the way he sort of had his own upbringing in a sense.
Do you think the fact that he had 3 daughters and his only son died as a very young child influenced that in any way? I mean, had he had a son, would that have maybe shifted the balance in any way? Do you know? What do you think?
I mean, that's actually a good point. I really don't know. I do know that the family talked about Langdon quite a bit. Like, they didn't forget about him. He was still present in their lives. But both Susy and Clara, if they were to have been boys, were to be named Henry, after Sam's younger brother, Henry, who died in a horrific steamboat explosion. So they were definitely prepared to have a boy. I know that. But there was never any indication, or at least none that I have found, at least. Please, if someone has any knowledge, enlighten me. But in all of my research, Sam has seemed very, very delighted to have 3 daughters.
Yeah. So just for I feel like we're just talking a little bit of insider ball here. Can one of you, either Grace or Steve, just briefly fill people in on Langdon Clemens and you know, his role as the firstborn child and what happened there?
Do you want to take this one, Steve?
Go ahead. I think you know the story.
Well, Langdon was the eldest child of the Clemens family. He was actually born about a month premature, and so he was very sickly as a baby. They do think he may have had some underlying health issues, but Langdon ended up dying, I think, before the age of 2 due to diphtheria, which, of course, was probably, he caught it very quickly due to the fact that he did have some underlying health conditions. But Sam blamed himself for basically his entire life for his son's death, because he thought that he hadn't, you know, covered his blanket up enough when they were on a carriage ride or something of that nature. So he really did take the blame pretty hard. He put that on himself for his son.
And this was a time when there were just, I mean, we're in this pandemic now. I mean, there were just communicable diseases everywhere all the time, especially involving children. And so the diphtheria was not from the carriage ride. It was no doubt from whatever contact he made with someone infected.
Right, and that's important to keep in mind. And you know, I think that we all know that Sam kind of ended up assuming guilt for a lot of things that he didn't necessarily earn guilt for, or need to feel guilty for, and it became kind of part of his persona toward the end of his life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just ask a couple more. What was your relationship like with your siblings? And how did your father's fame impact you all while you were growing up?
Another good question. These are all excellent questions.
Yeah, they are.
So Susy had a I would say, a relatively good relationship with both sisters. We know that she and Clara absolutely doted on Jean. She was very spoiled. And I think that was due to the fact that she was so much younger. She was 8 years younger than Susy and about 6 years younger than Clara. Susy and Clara got along relatively well. I would say that oftentimes Susy would be the one to draw Clara into theater and plays and things. They were both very musically inclined as well. Clara, of course, for those of you who don't know, went on to become a relatively famous singer in her own right, whereas Susy, sadly, never grew enough to sort of maintain that. But also, she and Clara was definitely a mastermind of some rather interesting schemes. One of which I can think of would be the oat bin scheme, where Clara thought it would be an excellent idea when the girls were rather young to go up into the hayloft of the carriage house and climb into the spring-loaded oat bin, which then slammed shut on them and their friend Daisy Warner, and so they almost smothered to death. So I actually did recently confirm that was Clara behind that. So
it doesn't sound like a Susy idea, frankly.
No, it
doesn't. Did Sam or Olivia actively encourage creativity among their daughters? Asks our dear friend Ann Elfrin.
And Steve, I'm so sorry. I keep answering these. Do you want to take any of these questions?
All right. You know all the answers. And I mean, they did, right? I mean, Sam himself encouraged and was delighted by his daughter's writings and sayings. He was, again, in this wonderful family sketchbook, there's a whole section of cute things that the kids said, that kind of a record that somebody might keep. And it has a marvelous name, which I can't repeat without looking it up. A record of the small fool. You know it. You should answer this.
No, I don't remember exactly how he says it. It's like the small foolishnesses.
A record of the small foolishnesses of Susy and Bay Clemens infants. Bay was Clara's nickname when she was a baby, and lasted a little beyond that probably. And it became from the way Susy pronounced the word baby, correct? Am I right?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I again, dear Grace, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we've got a lot of requests for a little bit of in character, a little snippet of your tour, perhaps, or can you go into character as Susy for us, please, just for a couple minutes, just to let us know what it feels like and what it sounds like. And you okay with that?
I am. I will have to ask your help, though, because I haven't given a tour since early March. So it's been a little while. And I do find that I do best when I'm interacting with people. So I will go into character, and you may talk to me in character. How about that? I'll try to remember a couple of little snippets from the tour, but it's a little difficult without having the house to help me out.
Well, imagine that Steve and I are on your tour. I'm taking the tour. So perhaps you can, do it like you would for me as a newbie. And
got my ticket. Here's my ticket.
ticket.
All right. Well,
thank you, Steve, for that reminder. Buy your ticket.
What's the first thing you say to people as you are greeting them, other than throw away your chewing gum, please, and that kind of thing?
Well, let me see if I can go into master thespian mode. Hello, I'm so terribly glad that you're here. My name is Susy Clemens, and I'm the oldest daughter of Mark Twain, you know. And, well, he's a dreadfully famous writer, and I think he might write the most wonderful books. And, well, of course, I'm rather blethering on, but I would like to show you our house, and we are a terribly happy family, you know. We consist of Papa, Mama, Jean, Clara, and me. And our last name is Clemens, by the way, and not Twain, because, of course, well, my father's real name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens, and, well, Mark Twain is just his pen name, but I'll talk more about that later. And I simply cannot wait to show you all our house, and my sisters and I think it is simply a galumptious house, and I certainly hope that you do too. Now, it is just a short walk from here, and I will go up those stairs, but, well, you can take one of those newfangled elevator machines if you'd like. They are right over in the corner. So would anyone like to take one of those? I won't be dreadfully disappointed if you do. Sorry, that's sort of the introduction before we go into the house itself. And then I talk a little bit about all of you, really. I like to interact with the guests. I like to ask where everyone's from. It's lots of fun when people say that they've traveled from another country or from California, and I say, oh, I hope you didn't have to take one of those steamships. They are rather dreadful.
Oh my gosh. Well, speaking of that, there are people here tonight from Anahola, Hawaii, and Bourne End, Buckingham, England, and all over the world. And it's just amazing. And somebody in the chat has commented that we should continue to do this online presentation even after we're the glorious day when we are able to meet in person again, because look at all the people who are learning about Susy Clemens and her life, who might not have been able to otherwise. So I can't thank you enough, Grace and Steve.
Let me just say one thing. 2 weeks from tonight, same time, same place, will be a discussion of Mark Twain and spiritualism. Somebody mentioned ghosts. Of course, the Clemens family lived in an age when spiritualism was in the air, and there was a great deal of that going on. And Mark Twain made tremendous fun of it, but also, later made a little bit of at least attempted use of it. And the speakers or the interviewees, because I'll be still kind of blabbing here, are Mallory Howard, the very one who frightened Grace and Grace frightened her, and who's our assistant curator and knows a great deal about this, and Jason Scapitici, who has been a historical interpreter, and he's a great historian, and it has a glorious perspective on this subject. So spiritualism, 5:30, June 11th, right here. And you'll find the link on the Mark Twain House website, correct, Jennifer?
Yes, and I will send it to all of you. And I will also send you a link to this program, which is being recorded as we speak. And the moment it's over, there's a link that I can send that you can rewatch it if you like. And I do, because of my role at the Mark Twain House, I do have to thank those of you. I really want to thank those of you who have donated so generously to the Mark Twain House and Museum during this program. We are really grateful to you as a staff and board of trustees and anybody who's able to give even a few dollars. It makes a huge difference. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for being part of the Mark Twain House and Museum family. And thank you so much, Grace and Steve. And what a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So we will see you in 2 weeks for Mallory and Jason and Steve's program. And Grace, you did such a lovely job. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we can't wait to see you in person at the Mark Twain House again.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Good. We had fun too. All right, everybody. Good night. Do the good night wave.